Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Cine 103, Class 8 Hollywood Musicals. And this is the history of motion pictures from the beginnings to 1945. I'm Professor Dave Echols. Yes, musicals, lots of great stuff to check out today. And I'd like to give you a little bit of advice. Maybe you've already been doing it, maybe not. But in class, I would be talking about some of the PowerPoint slides, and then I would show some film clips, and then I'd go back to the PowerPoint slides, and then I'd go back to the film clips. And I think that's probably the best way to do it. It's not very hard to do in Canvas if you're using Canvas. And I would recommend to do it that way rather than just to go blazing through the lecture and then look at the links to all the film clips. And there's a lot of links to the film clips, and I think the class would go a little smoother. I think it would make more sense if you go back and forth. But that's your choice. Do it any way you like. I hope you enjoy the topic and all the wonderful films that I've got picked out for you today. So, Hollywood musicals of the 1930s and 40s, and we're going to dive a little bit into the 1950s with some Gene Kelly stuff, Singing in the Rain. And so Hollywood musicals, of course, are a new genre. They didn't have musicals in the silent era, and so it was a pretty big thing when they first came out, kind of like gangster movies. I remember when we talked about gangster movies, there were 65 gangster movies in about the first 2 or 3 years of the 1930s. And musicals were kind of like that too. There were posters advertising all singing, all talking, all dancing, and so on. And since talkies came in, it seemed like there was going to be nothing but talk. There was hardly any silence at all. So there would lots and lots of sound, lots and lots of music, and so on. This is a scene from the Golddiggers of 1933, and that's Joan Blondell singing Remember My Forgotten Man, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But first, I wanted to run through some words and terms that might be a little bit unfamiliar as we go through some of these film clips and some of these films and stuff. Remember, this is like 80, 90 years ago, and language changes. It doesn't change nearly as much as it does from Shakespearean times, but it does change quite a bit, especially slang. And you might think about some of the slang, even from the 1960s, that maybe your parents use. And so now we're going all the way back to the 1930s and the 1920s. We talked about some of the slang with the gangsters, mugs and Tommy guns and all that kind of stuff. And there's a few more slang terms that I wanted to tell you about so that you could enjoy some of the clips that we're going to see. So the first one is Pig Latin, and that is from the song We're in the Money, and that's Ginger Rogers right there before she was paired up with Fred Astaire. And so that it's this wonderful song, We're in the Money, and try to listen to the lyrics if you can, or just turn on the subtitling. And they're going to talk about the wolf at the door, and we can look the landlord right in the eye, and things like that. Some wonderful references in this very upbeat song about being in the money. Now, this is 1933, and it was really the depth of the Depression, and we wouldn't climb out of the Depression for a few more years yet. But it's this wonderful, very optimistic song. And like I said, the lyrics are quite interesting. The lyrics are really quite interesting. There's a line about bread lines and things like that. So, Pig Latin. Well, I'd heard Pig Latin in old movies since forever, and I thought it came out of like the 1930s. And I did a little bit of research. Sometimes I actually do a little bit of research, and I found out that Pig Latin was first came out like 500 years ago. And learned people back in Shakespeare times, 400 years ago, 500 years ago, spoke Latin. And most people spoke vernacular. They spoke the local language. Instead of speaking Latin, they would speak Italian, or they would speak French or something like that. And the priests and the kings, and if not the kings, then certainly their advisors and the people that were sort of running things would speak Latin. And so Pig Latin was kind of a way to sound like you were speaking Latin, but it wasn't Latin at all. It wasn't Latin at all, kind of this fake Latin, if you will. So she's going to sing We're in the Money in Pig Latin, and Pig Latin in Pig Latin is ig pe atenle. Okay, you take the first letter off of pig, you put it at the end, and then you put an A at the end. And same thing for Latin, you take the L off of Latin and you put it at the end. So pig becomes ig pe, and Latin becomes atenle. Okay, and that's Pig Latin. Now I remember seeing some World War II movies with prisoners of war, and they'd be in German POW camps. This is in the movies, but I understand it was based on real life. And a lot of, maybe not a lot, but Germans could speak English, but their English wasn't really very strong. So if you were speaking English in Pig Latin, then it would be hard for the German guards, say, to understand what you were saying. And as a little bit of another side point, when Americans wanted to have a code that was nearly unbreakable for the Germans and certainly for the Japanese, they had Navajo Native Americans, and they were called the code breakers, the Navajo code breakers, and they could speak this language that almost nobody in America could speak except for the Navajo. So those would be the Navajo code breakers of World War II. Anyway, a little side point there. So Pig Latin is going to be sung in We're in the Money, and that's our first bit of slang. Next off, they're going to talk about the milkman, and the milkman, just like that, literally would bring milk to your door in bottles. And usually, however many you want, you'd leave out your empties, so that if you left out 4 empties, you'd probably know that, or he'd know that it would be 4 refills. I'm sure you could leave notes and that sort of thing, and I'm sure that people would get to know the milkman. And in a couple of scenes that we're going to see in our musicals, these chorus girls, Golddiggers, are so poor they're going to steal the milk from, well, it won't be a porch, but it'll be like in an apartment on the landing. So they're gonna joke about it, and they're gonna give it back. The other reference to Milkman is that the Broadway melody. I'm trying to remember the name of the song. Lullaby of Broadway. Sorry, Lullaby of Broadway. They're going to sing about a party girl, and she goes out dancing all night. And in the song, they're going to say, "Time to go home and go to bed. The milkman's on his way," which means it's bright and early the next morning. And so the milkman would be delivering milk to families for children and so on before breakfast. So it'd be probably almost still in the dark when the milkman would come through. And so there's a reference to milkman's on his way. There were other deliverers back in, I don't know how far back they go, really, probably back into the 1800s, and certainly in New York City. But another item that was delivered, and as long as we're talking about stuff that's delivered, you probably are familiar with newspapers being delivered. Maybe your family doesn't get a newspaper delivered in the morning, but you probably know about that. And there used to be the paper boy, not the milkman, but the paper boy. And the paper boy would be young kids junior high through high school, very likely, and they would have a paper route, and they would deliver the paper early in the morning and throw it onto your porch and all that. It was a great first job for young kids. Today, usually there's a big service that delivers newspapers, but sure, the newspapers are one of the things that you'd be familiar with that is delivered door to door, but there were a number of other things. Milk and also ice. Now, this is an ice box, and if you talk to somebody who's pretty old, it'd probably be grandparents, great-grandparents, I don't know. But some people refer to the ice box. They don't call it the refrigerator, they call it the ice box. And that's because it literally was an ice box, something like that, that was insulated, and the iceman would bring a big old chunk of ice and put it in there, and then your perishables like milk and eggs and whatever else you could get in there, meat for sure, would be in the ice box, and that would keep everything cold for a while. Then as refrigeration got cheaper and more affordable, more and more people could get refrigerators. But you might, and in the movies too, you might hear somebody talk about the ice box. And there's one right there. So these first couple of films we're going to look at are about Golddiggers. Golddiggers of 1933, Golddiggers of 1935, 1937. And so Golddiggers, and this is 1933, and we can see right off the bat that it is pre-code. And we've talked about pre-code, that era from when, usually people talk about it when sound came in, although technically everything before 1934 is pre-code, but most of the time they're referring to 1927, 1928, 1929 to about 1934 when the production codes started being enforced very, very strictly instead of loosely as they had been before that. These are Golddiggers, and Golddiggers was maybe not the nicest thing to call someone, but it's certainly nothing really, really awful. Not like the N-word or anything really awful like that. There are worse things that somebody could be called. And in these movies, they are usually young and pretty women. Well, they're always young and pretty women, and seeking male companionship for security, right? Not looking for someone who can afford to take care of them. And if we're looking at the role of women and the place of women in the 1930s and during the Depression, it was really a rough place to be for women who were unmarried. Women back then were expected to get married quickly, start having a family. If they had a career, possibly a secretary, possibly a sales clerk, or maybe a school teacher, then they would do that usually until they got married. And that was kind of the thought, right? That women would only work as long as it took until they could get married and have a family and all that. Of course, we all know many school teachers taught for their entire lives, and others as well. Although I suspect secretaries really working in an office with well-to-do men, oftentimes they would be probably taken out and not expected to work after they got married. It was a pretty rough time, pretty uncertain times for especially young women. They're not going to get particularly very good jobs. There are certain jobs that are going to be, like I say, women's jobs: teachers, nurses, store clerks, things like that. And then in showbiz, maybe actresses, or in Broadway or on Broadway, they could be showgirls. Now, there are stars in musicals, and there are people that sing in the chorus, and they're called chorus girls, chorus boys, chorus girls. They're the backups, and probably not being paid very much at all, but you're kind of in show business and you're hoping to make it big, and maybe come out of the chorus. There's even a very very well done Broadway show called Chorus Line, and it's about those unsung actors and actresses who are back in the chorus. So Golddiggers, and we're going to meet some Golddiggers in a couple of scenes, sort of all rooming together, sleeping in one big bed, and auditioning for shows and that sort of thing, and they're going to talk about how things used to be much better before the Depression and so on. Also, breadline, and I think breadlines are referenced in We're in the Money. That is an actual breadline. It looks to me like it's only men. I don't know that they were getting bread to take home maybe to their families or what, or women weren't expected to do such a thing. But there were breadlines and soup kitchens, and things were pretty hard for middle class types. Okay, these guys all look middle class. They're all wearing, you know, hats and coats and whatever, and ties and all that sort of thing. But they're having a hard time eating, and so there are breadlines and sometimes soup kitchens, and that would be something that you'd see certainly in big cities like New York during the Depression. And there's a soup kitchen, coffee and donuts too. That would be nice. And again, when I started tracking down these photos, it was kind of interesting to me that they were only men waiting in line. I guess the men would be the ones that would be unemployed. I suspect that women almost weren't even considered to be unemployed. The man was the breadwinner, as they used to say, and women were likely expected to be married and the mother and all that sort of thing. So when there's unemployment, generally they're talking about men being unemployed in these figures. And the other thing that kind of strikes me, we don't see too many people of color. There's somebody back here, and I can't tell, but these are otherwise pretty much all white men, and with unemployment figures somewhere around 20% or so, I would say that the true unemployment figures would be much higher, because women and African American men and women and Hispanics and Asians were hardly even counted. They were hardly even counted. When they're talking about people being out of work, the way society was back then, they would be talking about white men being out of work. And I suspect that the true unemployment figures would be much higher. Women today are half the workforce. Okay, so I don't even think, I'm not even sure how many women were even counted as being unemployed during the Depression. I suppose possibly some typical, you know, nurses, school teachers, shop clerks, and that sort of thing. But it seems to me that most unemployment was referring to men, and white men at that. So a number of the films we're going to start off with, coming out of Warner Brothers, mostly directed by Busby Berkeley, we'll talk about him in a second, were called backstage musicals. And that means that the singing and the music would mostly be done on stage. And that's kind of realistic, really. When we see a movie like Singing in the Rain, it's kind of unusual to see people singing, you know, in the streets and places, and odd, you know, in the store or something like that. Singing on a stage, and usually it's a Broadway stage, is quite natural. And then backstage, that's where all the romance is taking place. That's where all the romance is taking place. Now, later on, we're going to get into Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers and Gene Kelly and all that, and they aren't backstage musicals at all. They're going to break into song wherever they feel like breaking into song. But these first few years, especially the Warner Brothers Busby Berkeley stuff. They're called backstage musicals. And later on, when musicals with Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland are starting to happen in 38, 39, 40, 41, they're going to call them backyard musicals because they're high school kids. So they're going to sort of do a little bit of a play on words, backyard musicals. Anyway, backstage musical, all the romance, all that, and musicals are almost always with romance running through them. Romantic musical comedies, rarely dramas, and there's always going to be some romance in there. So one of the first songs we're going to hear is My Forgotten Man, or actually Remember My Forgotten Man. And that is referring to the Great War, which later was called World War I in the 1940s, but before the 1940s they didn't call it World War I, they called it the Great War. And there were veterans of that war who were promised bonus money, I think about 20 years or so after they left the service. They were promised bonus money, and when the Depression hit, and a lot of those people were still pretty young, probably in their 30s, were out of work, they wanted their bonuses early. They went to Washington, D.C., and they marched and wanted to get their bonus money early. They were called the Bonus Army. And there's a wonderful picture of the Bonus Army in Washington, D.C. And sadly, the government put them down quite brutally on horseback with clubs and things like that. And they were beaten back. But that song, "Remember My Forgotten Man," is about these guys and the Bonus Army. So a little bit of a transition from gangsters, and there's one of our best gangsters. There's Jimmy Cagney from Public Enemy, and lots of gangster movies. The Roaring Twenties, G-Man. But he also made musicals, and he won his Oscar in a musical called Yankee Doodle Dandy in the 1940s, so he was. He was a good singer and dancer. The documentary that we watched about the gangsters, one of the interviewees talked about how Cagney moved very nicely, kind of gracefully, and physically he was. It was quite nice to watch him. Physically how he moved, and a little chuck on the chin and that sort of thing that he does in Scarface. So right now, what you should do is pause this and go to the first link and look at Jimmy in Footlight Parade. And it's a musical. There's a scene within the musical. He's going to play a sailor, and he's going to dance with a woman called Shanghai Lil. And Shanghai Lil is played by a white woman. I don't know exactly what they're doing to her eyes. It's in black and white, so we don't know if she's in some sort of makeup, Asian sort of makeup, yellow face, it might be called. But it's very interesting. Shanghai Lil would very likely, if you don't have to look too hard to see her in Shanghai welcoming the sailors when they come to town as a prostitute. He says, "You're just a butterfly, going from man to man," and so on. And now it's kind of cleaned up for the movies, but that's pretty much what's going on here. Shanghai Lil, and it's played by she's played by Ruby Keeler. We'll see Ruby Keeler a couple of times in here. She's in 42nd Street, the girl that has to go on after the star has broken her ankle and all of that. But she's playing Shanghai Lil. She's going to speak in. She doesn't speak much. Mostly she's singing, but she's going to speak a little bit in broken pidgin Asian English, and so on. It's kind of embarrassing for sure. It's not the sort of thing we would think highly of today for sure. But as we look at these movies from 80 years ago, we are looking at a window into society. And we should never forget that. We're looking at a window. What was thought to be funny back then? What was thought to be dramatic? What was thought to be of no concern? And so on. So this is really kind of a nice window. Remember, this is the history of motion pictures, and so it's a history class on the side of being a class about movies. And so when we see these movies and how people are and how women are and minorities and all the whole rest of it, we are just going to remember, okay, that's the way things were, and how interesting, I didn't know that, and so on, right? So maybe it opens our eyes a little bit, just the way today's movies, as seen from 80 or 90 years from now, maybe stuff that we're doing today is going to seem very weird and quaint and old-fashioned and icky, okay? How could they treat such and such like that back in the 2020s? So we'll remember, right, that we're going pretty far back. Most of these movies are pretty good. They hold up pretty well. Casablanca and Citizen Kane and so on, and even these musicals, they hold up pretty well. But yeah, they're going to be referring to things that we probably wouldn't talk about these days. Okay, so hopefully you've checked out Jimmy dancing in Footlight Parade. Footlight Parade was made by the guy who made this film too. His name is Busby Berkeley. And before we get full on into the Busby Berkeley dance numbers, we're going to meet a wonderful trope, and that is the star is going to break her ankle, and the chorus girl is going to have to fill in. And it's just a real classic. And I don't know if this is the very first time in the movies that something like this has happened. It happens in sports movies, all sorts of places. And what this really does is it kind of gives us in the audience the thought that that could be me, right? I'm not a star. I'm not a star basketball player, football player, baseball player, or dancer, or chorus girl, or whatever, right? Or star singer. But they're taking someone out of the chorus or off the bench, right, in sports, and going in to save the day. And those of us in the audience, we can kind of identify with that. A lot of us can identify with that. We're not really stars, but we like to think that we could really do it and save the day if we're called on to do so. So we're going to see a little bit of that. That's Ruby Keeler, and there's a couple of links to that. And the producer director makes a wonderful speech. You're going out there. Oh, what does he call her? You're going out there, a kid, and you've got to come back a star. That's his line. You're going out there. Oh, I can't even remember it. Darn it. Anyway, you'll see it, right? It links to it. Watch it. And you've got to come back a star. So a wonderful trope for us. Okay, so now we'll dive deep into Busby Berkeley. Cool name, by the way. He is a choreographer. First and foremost, he didn't always direct the acting part, but he did the choreography. Later on, he would be able to direct even the acting parts of the film as well. He learned some of his designs when he was in World War I and doing drills and close order drills and that sort of thing with the army guys and their guns and attention and about face and shoulder arms and all that wonderful kind of stuff. So we learned some of that back then. He put it to good use when he got to Hollywood. And there's our kaleidoscopic, okay, kind of like a kaleidoscope there. These young women in this scene, they're floating on the water. That's how we could get a shot like that. Although sometimes they would just be on their backs on the stage. Sometimes bird's eye view, not always. We've seen some other nice angles like this, okay? And in a shot like this, the camera would be tracking through, they'd be moving the camera through the lines of the girls, the legs of the girls like that. And here we get one of them. I think it's by a waterfall or something. And yeah, so these are the backstage musicals. There it is again for you. And so what I'd like you to do is, again, pause and go through a number of the links that we have. There's Golddiggers of 1933. You're going to get to see My Forgotten Man, which is really nice. This is the only big, colorful Busby Berkeley film. That's Carmen Miranda, the girl in the Tutti Frutti hat. She's singing. But look at these links I have for you. My Forgotten Man, We're in the Money in Pig Latin. Then there's a nice little scene of the ladies in their apartment and stealing milk and so on. There's some wonderful lines and pretty good comedy too, I have to say. Then there is the 42nd Street scene. You're going out there, a kid. I think he says you're just going out there a kid and you've got to come back a star. And so there's that trope. And then there's 3 parts. It's a long number in Golddiggers of 1935, The Lullaby of Broadway. And in the movie, it takes I guess it's 12 or 13 minutes long in the movie, and for some reason YouTube wasn't going to give me the whole thing. But it kind of tells a story and has a very weird ending. So I want you to watch all 3 parts, watch it to the ending, think about it. And it's the story of a party girl. Basically, she's a party girl. Maybe from the 1920s, she would have been called a flapper, like Clara Bow. And there's a young man, Dick Powell, who takes her out, and they're nicely dressed, tuxedo and all that, and they go out to clubs, partying, and so on. And the number that they're going to, that not them, but the dancers are going to do in Lullaby at Broadway, there has to be 100 men and 100 women, or I don't know, there's a lot. And they're all going to tap in rhythm. And lots of really cool angles. There's even some people are going to be tap dancing on a glass floor, and the camera's going to be from underneath. The set is amazing. The lighting is very, very cool. Very reminiscent of film noir in part. Long, long shadows and so on. We're going to see the milkman on his way. They're going to sing, you know, the milkman's on his way, and time for her to go home, all of that. She's going to sleep all day, and then when it gets dark again, at 6 o'clock, she's going to wake up and go out partying. So I hope you watch all the 3 parts of The Lullaby of Broadway. And then next up, there's a wonderful scene from Dames. Very psychedelic for sure. Part of it really seems kind of trippy, really, for lack of a better word. And then, so weird, we're going to see some kind of dancing pianos in another Busby Berkeley number. And, you know, they would have people that are moving the pianos and other people around. There would be probably men dressed in black, so you can't see them. But if you look closely, you can see the men underneath the pianos pushing them around and doing these weird wave moves and things like that. So, yeah, this would be a good time to pause, watch all that stuff, and then when we come back, we're going to go to Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Okay, hope you got to see all of that. Now, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Fred and Ginger, Astaire and Rogers, every way you want to say it. They made 8 films together, and mostly it is Depression era escapism, formal wear. Fred looks great, a slender dancer, very, looks great in a tuxedo, and Ginger would be wearing the latest fashions of the 1930s, right? So this would be from top fashion designers and so on from the 1930s. And a lot of times there would be very luxurious settings, lavish hotels. The hotel rooms are, I don't know, I've never seen a hotel room as big. But, you know, that's Hollywood and so on. So anyway, giant hotel rooms we're going to see in Top Hat and throughout. They might be at resorts, sometimes on cruise ships, although I don't think they called them cruise ships back then, ocean liners. Airplanes, which have been very rare for people to travel on airplanes in the 1930s, but they are playing often very rich people in one. It's Top Hat, and when they first meet, Fred has made not a great first impression on Ginger, so he goes next morning, goes down to the flower shop in the hotel and buys out every flower in the flower shop in the hotel. So that's kind of extravagant, and to an audience in 1935, it's like crazy that somebody would do something like that. But that's kind of what was going on. We're kind of forgetting that the Depression, the old man Depression, and so on. And Hollywood has almost always been about escapism. I mean, think about it today. We go to off to Star Wars and other planets a long time ago and far, far away, and galaxies and superheroes and Hogwarts and whatever. And so we still like to escape, for the most part. We like to escape into our movies, and really think about it. What do you want to see? The new action superhero movie when movie theaters the next time you go to see a movie, or do you want to see that movie about the poor immigrants trying to cross the Mediterranean for a better life in Europe, or crossing the border to get into America to feed the family and the kids, and that stirring story of triumph? Okay, probably not. Probably not. We see that in the newspapers, and we know that's part of our lives, and we probably don't want to see movies about struggle and immigrants and DACA and all that kind of stuff. We want to be transported to a faraway place, a faraway land, and so that was what was going on in the 1930s and during the Depression, and even when the 30s are over, still. We're going to meet a character actor. His name is Eric Blore, and he is the English butler. And I wanted to call attention to him. And when we get into horror movies, there's a woman and Una O'Connor. And when we get into film noir, we've got another guy, Peter Lorre. And I wanted to call attention to these three because they are the spice in Hollywood movies. They're not the stars. They're not the main course. They're not Fred Astaire, and they're not, they're not Frankenstein or Dracula. They're not the detective or anything like that. They're not Gene Kelly or Humphrey Bogart. But they are the spice. They're the chilies and the peppers and the whatever, the oreganos and all that, right? These character actors are also under contract at the studios. So Eric Blore would be in multiple, maybe Fred and Ginger movies. We're going to see him again later when we get into screwball comedy with as an English butler again. And so I just want to call attention to these people, unsung heroes. Really, they're part of the movies too. and they are they're going to make the movies better, right? There's only so much that Fred and Ginger can do, and without all the character actors appearing in the movie, Fred's friend is a character actor in the movie, and we see him, Edward Everett Horton, we see him again and again, and we see Ginger's girlfriend again and again, and the same thing goes for the horror movies. The lady who screams so loud, we're going to see her again and again. And the slimy, smarmy guy in the film noir movies, we're going to see him again and again. And I wanted to call attention to these guys. So the first one is Eric Blore, and he's very cool. I just love this guy. He's very funny, and he's very proper and prim and British and all of that. So there we are from, I think that's Shall We Dance. There's Fred in a tuxedo again, and Ginger dancing. And those are not all of them, but those are some of the really good ones that they made. Top Hat is the one that I have some links to, but there's also, I think, a link to some other Fred and Ginger films. And also Fred solo, I have a link to him dancing. It's called Royal Wedding, and he's going to dance on the ceiling. Very cool movie. After Fred went solo, and he danced with lots of other female dancers and singers. But I think he's mostly known for Fred and Ginger. But he stayed in musicals. Ginger wanted to stretch out a little bit and do other things, and did comedies and dramas and that sort of thing. I don't know that she made many more musicals after she and Fred amicably, I would say, separated and went their separate ways. Fred mostly did the choreography for their films. Ginger could go off and do other things, and then when she was ready to go, she would come back, and Fred and some of the other people would have the choreography all done and all set to go, and then Fred and Ginger would practice and practice and practice, and they would have blisters. They would have blisters. Their shoes would be, I mean, I don't want to get too gross, but they would have blood in their shoes, right? Blood in their shoes from blisters, from practicing. Fred insisted that they be shot from head to toe. He didn't want lots of editing and shots of their hands and heads and feet and all that. He wanted a bare minimum of editing, maybe from one angle to another, but always from head to toe. And he insisted on that with Fred and Ginger. And he wanted people to know that, you know, it wasn't movie magic. They could get through the number, the dance number, all at once, right? It wasn't tricks of editing or anything like that. That they were so good they could dance straight on through the number. So there's lots and lots of Fred and Ginger stuff on YouTube. I've linked to the Dancing on the Ceiling and a few other ones from Top Hat, Cheek to Cheek, and Night and Day. Some pretty good ones. But please take this time right now and go off and look at the Fred and Ginger links. Next up, now we're going to focus on MGM, and they were the musicals studio. Now, Fred and Ginger worked at RKO, and Busby Berkeley was at Warner Brothers and so on, but MGM really took it a whole nother level. They often, not always, they often did their musicals in color, and the main movies of the 30s and 40s that were in color would be animated films, Disney, all the animated films, the cartoons, Bugs Bunny, all that stuff, and musicals, Singing in the Rain and America in Paris, and movies like that. So they were more expensive. Matter of fact, movies like Singing in the Rain were the big expensive movies of the day. It wasn't all that expensive to do a Western. You know, some people and some horses and some fronts of the town, right? They didn't have to build the whole livery stable or the whole jail or anything like that. All they had to do is put up the fronts, the movie fronts, and that sort of thing, and go off outside of town, outside of LA, and shoot a western or a war picture or something like that. But the big expensive movies would be the musicals. They would be often shot in color, which costs more money, right? All the processing the film, that would cost more money, and the sets, and all the extra people, and the dancers, and all that sort of thing. So musicals often would be the big, expensive movies of that era. Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland they played teens into their 20s. Both of them were small-ish. Mickey, I think maybe he was 5'3" or 5'4", something like that. He could play young for deep into his 20s for sure. And Judy also petite, maybe 5'1" or 5'2", something like that. So they could play teens for quite a while. And at one point they got dubbed backyard musicals. And so I've linked to a number of Mickey and Judy backyard musicals. The plots are very, very similar. In a lot of them, they decide to put on a show. Hey, everybody. Hey, gang. Let's put on a show. And there are wonderful montages. Normally, I'd be showing clips from a compilation film that came out in the 1970s called That's Entertainment. Unfortunately, it's not online, so I can't link to That's Entertainment, but there's plenty of Mickey and Judy films to look at. And, their names change, but it looks like a half a dozen or more. The plot is that she wants to be a singer and he wants to be a director or write music or some such thing. And at some point, they can't make it on Broadway or something like that, so they decide to put on a show. Hey, everybody, let's put on a show. They get a brainstorm. The light bulb goes off, and so they're going to put it on in the barn or in the school gymnasium or something like that. And they keep getting bigger and bigger as those movies got more and more popular. The sets got bigger and bigger and bigger. And in the documentary, at one point, Mickey says, in the film, That's Entertainment. If you like musicals, track it down. It was made in the 1970s, and the movie industry had really changed a lot in the 1970s. The New Hollywood and movies like The Graduate in 2001 and The Godfather were out, and these old musicals were kind of like old-fashioned and out of a different era. And MGM was having a little bit of a hard time with making ends meet and all of that in this New Hollywood era. And so they put together a compilation film, and they got their stars from the 30s and 40s and 50s, and now it's the 70s, so it's 20, 25 years later, and these guys and gals, men and women, are in their maybe 40s or 50s, something like that. They're not ancient, trust me, they're not ancient. So Mickey Rooney hosts one segment, and Frank Sinatra hosts a segment, and a number of people host segments. Judy, sadly, had passed on since she died, I believe, in the 1960s, so she passed on a bit earlier. Mickey says, where we got all that energy, I'll never know. And usually I have to interrupt the documentary to note that both Mickey and Judy were given drugs by the studio doctors, sadly. And the studio people were taking them too, the directors and the producers. They were taking them, energy stuff, pet pills. Sometimes they call them diet pills. The studio was always pressuring poor Judy to lose some weight. Never Mickey, but always Judy to lose some weight. So there were diet pills, give them some energy, all that kind of stuff. Sometimes the doctors would give them shots, vitamin shots and things like that. And then having trouble to sleep at night, there would be sleeping pills. And then the next morning, when you're all groggy from the sleeping pills, the studio would help provide more pick-me-up type pills. And Judy noted had drug problems throughout her life, and others too, and Mickey as well. And that's sad, but fairly well known. So anyway, that's where some of the energy and so on came from. Mickey was loved by Louis B. Mayer. Louis just thought he was the great all-American kid, talented. He could sing, he could dance, he could play the drums, he could do all that kind of stuff, and so he was a real favorite at the studio for a while. And Judy too, Wizard of Oz, of course, and a lot of other stuff. So as you go through some of these films that I have links to, and this also, it comes off of the documentary. There's a weird scene, and when you see it, you'll know. And they are in blackface. That's the term, blackface. And they're singing a number from a movie called Showboat that takes place on the Mississippi River. Some of the characters are African American, and some of the characters are mixed. And so Mickey and Judy are doing a homage to Showboat, and they are in blackface. And Fred Astaire has done blackface as well in a tribute to a wonderful tap dancer that Fred idolized named Bill Robinson, Bill Bojangles Robinson. And so I wanted to say a few words about blackface. It's certainly nothing that should be done today. It's very derogatory, although I think blacks, in order just to stay employed, would sort of laugh it off. I can't speak for African Americans of the 30s or 40s, but it seems to me from interviews and biographies and stuff that they would say, well, you know, we saw it, we did it, we didn't say anything about it. We wanted to keep our jobs and so on. And some blacks would even darken up, if you can believe that. They would put on this sort of makeup, not exactly shoe polish, but put on this makeup. It goes back to the 1880s. Blackface does. Minstrel shows is the term. And happy slaves, happy former slaves, yeah, believe it or not, yep, playing happy slaves, singing on the plantation, picking cotton, and the whole idea of the happy slaves and minstrels goes back to the just after the Civil War. So it's really awful stuff, and it's called blackface. There's also terms for brownface, possibly playing Hispanics or Middle Easterners, right? Somebody might do brown face, and also the other term would be yellow face, playing Asians. It's not good or right or funny in any instance, and if anybody thinks it's funny and, hey, let's do this for Halloween, really don't. Okay, really don't. It's not funny playing a migrant or an ex-slave or anything, any of that sort of thing, and speaking in that awful language, pidgin English. So I just want to talk about it. Back then, back in the 30s and 40s, it was all meant in good fun. And Mickey and Judy and Fred and lots of people had done blackface over the years, but it's certainly nothing that we would expect to see today. That's for darn sure. So I always think it's a good time to address that when we talk about these older movies, right, and how people are referred to. And there's a few more things that I'll talk about as we go through. If you're not paying attention, it sort of goes by kind of fast. But usually I will hit the pause button and talk about these things just a little bit. Okay, so if you watch some of the Mickey and Judy stuff, fantastic. And next up, Esther Williams, and she was an MGM musical swimming star. And there she is, and made some big, bright, colorful swimming movies. Really amazing stuff. And quite the money's all on the screen. Let me put it that way. The money's definitely on the screen. It's all up there. Lots of color and diving and choruses of men and women on swings, swinging out over the water and diving into the water and swimming underneath. There's one I saw, an underwater ballet to some and the women under the water are doing a ballet, and of course they're graceful and gorgeous and all that. And I have to admit, I have trouble watching some of that stuff because I'm kind of holding my breath along with them. And I know that they're only doing very short scenes, 30 seconds or something like that. And then there are tubes of water or tubes of air under there that they can take a breath from and then keep going. But I just feel a little uncomfortable watching people underwater for so long. And still with MGM, Gene Kelly, the biggest of the MGM stars. And there he is in his signature role, Singing in the Rain. He also did An American in Paris, another wonderful film. The whole final, 25 minutes of the movie is a ballet suite. Quite astounding, it really is. It's really something. If you're into musicals, then after you watch his Singing in the Rain, then track down the American in Paris suite and gorgeous sets, and it's really something. Anyway, I've linked to a nice best of Gene Kelly that I found, and really fantastic stuff. When he did Sing in the Rain, he was the co-director and a choreographer and all of that. And when he did this scene, he had a fever. I don't know if it was 101 or something like that, but he had a fever. But by golly, he went out there and he did it. And, it would be take after take. It would take all day and maybe even a couple of days to do a big number like Singing in the Rain. And this would be a big, expensive number to do. They'd have to get the rain machines going, and they would be on their fake set, and you could sort of dress it up to be a city, not with the skyscrapers, but kind of a city one. Here it's dressed up to be like Hollywood, and it's just Gene. There's two other people kind of at the end, but the camera's moving around. The camera operator and the director would be on a big crane. There would be music playback and lighting cues and water and all that. So it'd be kind of a big deal behind the camera, and just Gene out there in front of the camera singing the rain. Wonderful stuff. Okay, and I hope you watched that. Away from MGM, one of the biggest musical stars of the 1930s was a child. Okay, Shirley Temple, child star of the musicals. And when we were talking about merchandising characters back in the 20s, and we saw Charlie Chaplin with little Charlie Chaplin dolls, well, there were lots of little Shirley Temple dolls with her curly hair like that. There would be Shirley Temple, talent contests, and lots of little girls would get their hair all done like that, and they'd like a talent show, and they'd dance and sing and all that kind of thing. She was the biggest star at Fox and one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. But if you're a child star, then you've only got a precious few years where you're cute. Okay, when you're too little, you really can't memorize lines and so on. And we'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about the Little Rascals. 2, 3, so on. But as a 4-year-old, you can start to memorize lines a little bit, and you're pretty darn cute. And 5, for sure, and 6, by the time kids are 6, they can memorize more lines, they can do more singing, more dancing, all of that. 7, you start to get a little bit bigger at 8, 9, 10, and pretty soon, you start maturing. 10, 11, 12, and that whole cuteness is kind of gone. So it's a short period right there to be a young child star. Shirley made some other movies when she was a little bit, 14, 15, 16, a little bit into her 20s. But her main fame was as a child star, and she had a pretty good life. A lot of child stars, sometimes their parents ran off with their money. Sometimes they had other kinds of problems and things in their lives. Some of the Little Rascals had troubled at times and so on. I don't want to get too heavy into that, but Shirley had a very good afterlife. She was actually a UN ambassador and did pretty well for herself as an adult. But too many young kids. Jackie Coogan was the kid in the Charlie Chaplin movie, and the law that the California legislators wrote is called it's either called Coogan's Law or Jackie's Law, and it was written specifically to right the wrongs of the sort of thing that happened to Jackie Coogan when his parents taking his money and sort of running off and so on. So anyway, Shirley Temple did a couple of films with the famous Bill Bojangles Robinson, the man that Fred Astaire idolized. He was would have been a big star in right around the turn of the century, right around 1900 or so, or even in the 1890s. And one of the best paid entertainers in the country. And so by the time he's making these movies with Shirley Temple, he's older. I think he's in his 50s, possibly in his 60s. He still has all the grace and style that you would expect. But of course, he's dancing with a white child. There's no way that in that era that a black adult man would dance with a white adult woman. And television would even have trouble with that sort of thing in the 1950s, and even a little bit into the 1960s. Adults maybe holding hands would be kind of shocking, especially to people in the South. But with Bill Robinson, and in a couple of movies, he's playing a slave. He's playing a happy slave. The Littlest Colonel, I think it's called, something like that. And Shirley's father is missing. I think he's got amnesia. But the kindly slave, played by Bill Robinson, is there, and he teaches her to dance and sing a little bit. But that's as far as that can go, right? That's as far as that can go. Is the Bill Robinson would be dancing with a child, and not even really at the prime of his life. But it is wonderful stuff. And Shirley loved Bill, thought the highest of him, and he thought she was just great too and very talented. And so it's a nice story about their pairing, but it's kind of sad that he doesn't really get to star in movies and really do the full-on dancing with an adult female. So linking to all this is a film from the Coen brothers. I love the Coen brothers. We don't talk about them in the 103 class. They get to be featured prominently in the 104 class. But they have a couple of movies. They love movies, and when we talk about screwball comedies, we will link to their film Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Here, I wanted to link to Hail Caesar from 2016 because it is set at a very thinly disguised MGM from around 1950. And so in that film, and I've just linked to the trailer. It's a great movie. I love it. I've watched it on numerous occasions. And you can watch the movie for extra credit, but please watch the trailer. That's Scarlett Johansson, if you don't recognize her, and she is playing a thinly disguised Esther Williams. There are dancing sailors. There's a singing cowboy. There are gossip columnists, and so on. And even as was the in the period in the 1950s, a biblical epics were kind of big in the 1950s for various reasons. I'm not sure exactly why. It seemed kind of like a foreign land or foreign country or foreign planet, really, 2,000 years ago with chariots and pyramids and all that. So Hollywood went kind of biblically crazy in the 1950s. And the film within a film, Hail Caesar, is the one that the Coen brothers are also going to parody. And it's a wonderful film. So anyway, watch Hail Caesar, or watch the trailer at least, and think about possibly watching it for an extra credit paper. So that's it for this week. Cine 103, Class 8 Hollywood Musicals. Thank you so much for joining me. Please watch all of those and do some digging and get lost and go down the rabbit hole and have a lot of fun with all those weird and crazy musicals. To me, they're kind of psychedelic. And maybe I don't know what for you, but some of that stuff, it really does seem kind of psychedelic. Coming up, we have more great stuff. We have animation, so we're going to talk about Walt Disney and Snow White. We've also got the Little Rascals coming up, and we've got horror coming up. So we've got Dracula and Frankenstein and the Invisible Man and the Wolfman and the Mummy and all that, and King Kong. So those are all coming up in future classes. For now, Professor Dave Echols signing off. Thank you so much.